Oh, we're recording now. Okay. Okay, so doing something a little different here. So I'm here with Messianic Drew here. Subscribe to his channel, everybody here.
Yeah, do that.
Even though he's got more subscribers, and maybe you probably already heard of it. But if you have not, subscribe to his channel here. He has a lot of good videos and everything. So I guess this time we're just going to be having a dialogue or talking about whatever.
Yeah, I have no idea.
I haven't figured it out yet here. I think this could be interesting. It's unscripted, of course, so I'm probably going to ramble on a bit, so I apologize about that. So, what are we going to talk about here?
I don't know. It's like we're both in Dr. Craig's Defenders class, and we like talk about things for a really long time. We're like, you know what, Cody? You haven't like posted videos in like forever, but we talk about all this kind of crazy stuff that really should go on videos. Like this guy is completely up to date on like all the whole like internet stuff debates.
The
Like
YouTube drama.
yeah,
so
the
to
YouTube
speak.
drama of like the internet atheists and that kind of stuff. I'm not really so much up on that. I'm too like busy with schoolwork and
Which
other
it's
material.
YouTube drama's kind of died down a bit here.
Yeah, but still, there's plenty to talk about. You were talking to me about a bunch of this stuff.
I mean,
like this week.
the YouTube drama, like, really, I think since Veritas left YouTube, it's kind of gone downhill. Because before, when he was around, there were, like, all the main guys were putting videos. Like Sisyphus Redeemed, Tool Time, Prof MTH still make, these guys still make videos, just not the frequency they used to. Theoretical BS and Antaboo even, and all those guys. Not so much anymore, though. Probably because a lot's been said with these guys, and I don't know. I mean, I guess I mean I've never directly tangled with most of these. I mean, obviously know more. I've talked to Antaboo and know more a bit, and that's about it. I haven't really made. Well, I made the video reply to Sisyphus Redeemed. That was on abortion, but
yeah, I'm hoping what's going to go on here is going to be more like a weekly series that Cody will have, like me or some other one of his friends in Dr. Craig's class, and we can just talk about whatever's going on this week. So, like, what were you talking to Dr. Craig about? Like, I know you were like
what was
after class, right? You were like totally monopolizing his time, which is fine because you have a lot to say, and he appreciates it.
Yeah,
you can listen to him on the podcast too.
Yeah, the podcast is a year behind. He says Tristram Shandy runs these. For those of you who read Dr. Craig's work, you may be aware of the Tristram Shandy paradox about the guy writes his autobiography so slowly it takes a year to write the events of the day. Well, the podcasts are a year behind. So if you ever come to the Defenders class, you're gonna find out how far behind it is.
Yeah, basically it becomes the class, and you like let's say make a comment. It'll be about a year until you're able to finally hear yourself. So it's like a year.
But no, I was just asking Dr. Craig about whether he would consider himself a Thomistic dualist, kind of like a lot like J.P. Moreland.
Okay. Well, what we'll need to do then is explain to our audience here the difference between like Cartesian and Thomistic dualism. Like, there's different theories of the mind in our like regular. How does the mind work? That I have this center of self-consciousness. How does that seem to operate? Well, there's multiple theories. One is this idea that the mind that first of all, that the physical world exists, like physicalism. There's this, and the mind's just a function of atoms banging around from the brain. So it's purely just the brain's working. That's physicalism. There's this opposite view, which is sort of like the Matrix, where your mind is just the center of self-consciousness, and this whole world of sense experience I've got around here is just sort of like illusory. So nothing exists but the mind, and this whole world is like kind of this mental construct. Then there's dualism, where you have this immaterial self, and then you have a physical world, and they both exist. And the issue with it becomes generally like, how do these two things interact? How does something physical interact with something non-physical? And so you have two solutions. One is by, that we're all familiar with, or we're familiar with. Yeah.
Most people are familiar. You're about to talk about Cartesian dualism.
Yeah, Descartes.
That's what most people think of when they think dualism. René Descartes.
So Descartes basically thought, yeah, I can imagine my consciousness without my body, right? I can sort of imagine, well, maybe I'm just a brain in a vat, or maybe I'm having a dream right now. So I can imagine my consciousness without my body, but I can't like imagine what my body without my consciousness, something like that.
No, the argument he gave was, he said, because I can conceive of myself existing without a body, therefore via the law of identity, because it means it's therefore I could possibly exist disembodied, and due to the law of identity, because there's something that's possibly true of me that isn't true of my body, therefore I and my body are not the same thing. That was the argument in a nutshell that Descartes gave.
Okay, so he sort of has this idea that the soul is not like a ghost. There's this idea that the soul that we popular thing we think of, that the soul is this ghostly-like thing. This
I think Descartes actually did. I think no, I think he did think that.
I thought. All right.
If not, then I'm sure. Hopefully, people in the comments will correct me on that.
I think our friend Jeremy was like who's a philosopher, was like
he
talking
goes to
about
Dr. Craig's defenders class.
He does as well.
Yeah.
But he was saying how Descartes resisted the extension of the soul, and I think Dr. Craig's view of the soul, I'm not 100% sure about this, is that the soul is not located anywhere. It's not extended. It doesn't have space or it's not anywhere in space. It's just totally non-spatial, but somehow it interacts with the mind. That's Descartes' view. But then there's Thomas Aquinas' view. I'm not as familiar about it, but I know you've been studying it for a while. So could you tell us how does Thomas Aquinas think of the soul differently than Descartes?
Yeah, well, Descartes basically thought that the soul was just your mind, and that he thought the body, right, could exist. I'm explaining this because this is relevant to Aquinas. But Descartes always thought the body would still be alive without the soul, but there would just be no conscious mind. There would be no mind, no consciousness.
Sort of like a zombie, then.
You kind of like a zombie. You're just without the soul, you just kind of have a body that's just sitting there not doing anything, except maybe being biologically alive. I'm pretty sure that's what Descartes thought. Thomas Aquinas, though, thinks the soul was what animates the body and makes it alive. It's more than just the mind, the conscious mind. And I do confess, Dr. Craig even said this too. I mean, Dr. Craig, I was saying he doesn't fully understand some of Aquinas' dualism, and there are bits of it that I admit are a little confusing because it's based on Aristotle's metaphysics about, like he said, is what gives the body form or something like that. Well, that whole thing, which I'm a little hazy on that.
I guess the difference with Plato thought that in addition to the matter that exists, like the physical stuff that my shirt's made out of, there also exists these forms, but these forms are in like a Platonic heaven. So it's like squareness, this sort of perfect squareness exists outside of space and time. But with Aristotle, he thought that the form is actually in the object. So the shape of, let's say, my shirt is actually in the shirt. So there's this material, and there's a shape which gives it its existence and gives it its, I don't know, configuration space.
It's a lot like that. It's a lot like that with Aquinas, except it was with the soul. That's a lot like how Aquinas viewed the relationship between the soul and the body. I think it is worth noting that J.P. Moreland does state in his book Body and Soul that he doesn't think. I mean, there are differences. He says. I mean, he doesn't purport that the view he defends is exactly like what Thomas Aquinas gave, but it's very similar in the sense that he thinks that the soul is what makes the body alive. And I was asking Dr. Craig what he thought, and he kind of just said he's not fully sure what to think really of Thomistic dualism, because he admits that he hasn't studied this area near as well as J.P. Moreland has.
Yeah.
But I don't know, he just said he's not entirely sure. I mean, he's just doesn't really lean much toward the idea that the soul is what makes the body alive kind of view. So, but he finally just said, I'm not entirely sure. So that's what I was asking.
I know we sort of I know I've discussed this with Dr. Craig. He seems to go, I think, more the Cartesian route, thinking that the soul has no extension whatsoever.
Yeah, I think he leans more in that direction.
I go more with J.P. Moreland. The soul is immaterial, but it's almost like kind of a phantasmal organism, that it is actually connected, physically, to the body, as though like a ghost. And this is sort of explained through people having these near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences where they're in sort of their body shape that's sort of floating toward the sun.
Yeah, I think I seem to recall Dr. Craig once saying that he was that one of the reasons he's sort of skeptical a little bit of near-death experiences is because of his view of the soul. He kind of resists the idea of an unembodied consciousness sort of floating.
Yeah.
But he says he's open to them. I mean, he's not dismissing them or anything.
Yeah.
But I would be more with you on.
Okay,
this.
so a little bit more on that.
I'd be more with the Thomistic in Moreland's crowd. I'd be more with what he thinks about the soul, and that's about all I can think about that.
Yeah. All right, that's all we can think about the topic of the.
Soul. Wait. Speaking of the soul, though, Richard Swinburne, because I confess I have not read Richard Swinburne's Evolution of the Soul or his work about dualism, but from what I understand, and DPR Jones, who's an atheist here on YouTube, made a video not too long ago against substance dualism. He was talking about Richard Swinburne. Again, I know it's a little risky getting it from him here because I haven't read Swinburne, but he says that Swinburne seems to view the soul is sort of like this kind of ectoplasm sort of stuff. That was the example of D.P.R. Jones. That he even gave a little animation thing of this blob with the word ectoplasm written on it.
Did he give like the Ghostbusters and they're like, let's steal people's souls?
No, he
don't cross the streams.
No, he didn't make a Ghostbusters joke, but he should have.
He should have, definitely.
That would have been awesome because you can't think of ectoplasm and not think Ghostbusters.
Exactly.
Blast you with those guns and they have to suck your soul. I don't know. I read Swinburne, so I don't know fully. I know Swinburne is a Cartesian dualist. He's not a Thomistic dualist, so I do know he differs from Moreland in that respect. So he's on the Cartesian side. But I don't know, maybe Jeremy said he was going to read Evolution of the Soul. So
yes, maybe if you could have him like in my spot, let's say maybe next week.
Yeah, I could just ask him about what that means. So yeah.
All right, if you're gonna, which way do you lean? More toward Cartesian? Or
I lean more towards a Thomistic, dualistic kind of view.
So but let's say if I'm like René Descartes and I've got like the awesome like facial hair and the Frenchman, the French accent over there. How should I? Why should I be a Thomist there, Cody?
Well,
that's a horrible French accent.
I mean, I admit I don't have like a knockdown argument against Cartesian dualism.
Okay.
I mean, but I know really one of the things that's really helped me sway more towards that is really my whole talk on the abortion debate here. I mean, I think Thomistic dualism and even Midkiller. This can be a little context. Midkiller took this route in his he had a discussion with Midkiller too, by the way. Subscribe to his channel, guys, if you have not. He's a really good Christian apologist here on YouTube. Hasn't made a lot of videos in a while, but
we went to the same high school together.
Yeah, that's right.
He was like I don't know how many years behind me. He's like 6 years behind me or something like that.
He's in college right now.
Yeah, it's a good number of years.
But anyway,
I didn't see him directly, but it's like same high school.
Sisyphus Redeemed, who's an atheist user here on YouTube, which subscribe to him too. He's actually pretty good. He's a professional philosopher.
Oh, that's nice.
The screen went blank for a second. Okay. But one objection Sisyphus Redeemed was they were talking about abortion, and he was saying that well, how do you know the soul comes in at conception here? Because if the soul is the mind, like Descartes' kind of idea, then how can you really say the soul, an embryo has a soul at conception? Well, one thing, first of all, I will state I don't think it's necessary to talk about the soul to defend the pro-life position. But if you're going to get into that discussion, I think that Midkiller took this route too. Midkiller started saying said he was a Thomistic dualist. He said that's only a problem if you're a Cartesian dualist. But if you're a Thomistic dualist, like me, he was saying, then if you think the soul is what animates the body and makes it alive, then you could easily say that it's ensouled from conception on a Thomistic dualist account. Yeah. And also, I was reading through a book by Robert George and I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly, Christopher Tolson, I think. The book is called Embryo: A Defense of Human Life, and there's a part where they argue against dualism. I mean, they weren't clear with their terminology here, but they were talking about how humans are not just like in Men in Black, the guy. A man sort of inside, with the levers controlling the body and everything.
Yeah. In philosophy, we sort of call it a homunculus, like a small little person inside the head. Yeah, like because if you get a Cartesian dualist account seems to lean in that direction, where you have like the mind, that's sort of controlling the body here, whereas a Thomistic dualism, they're a little bit more intertwined here. Like a Thomistic dualist account, I think you could say. Because one objection that Peter Van Inwagen, in his book Metaphysics, was raising against dualism was he was saying that, like, if I were to say punch you, I would say that I punched Drew. I punched Drew. I hurt you. But Inwagen was saying, well, if you're a dualist, and he's clearly thinking a Cartesian dualist here, how can you say I really punched you? What you really should say is I moved my body in a sense to punch your body, but I didn't really hit you, so to speak. Frankly, though, I'm skeptical of semantical arguments like that. But a Thomistic dualist could easily just say, well, no, you did hit You hit me because my body is part of me then.
Yeah, your body is part of me.
It's not like there's this me and then there's this body which is sort of like my car, what I happen to sort of be in and be controlling at the time.
Though granted, JP does use that analogy, but it's just an analogy.
Sorry, he does?
Well, he uses that JP Moreland uses that he only uses that to respond to the the objection against dualism. I forget what's the name of it. It's the common objection that says that, well, if you damage parts of my brain, it seems to affect my personality.
Okay.
This seems to be a problem for dualism, and Moreland uses the car analogy. Like, if I'm driving in a car and you damage the brakes to where I can't hit the brakes, I won't be able to hit the brakes. Or if you damage it to where I can only turn left, I'm only going to be able to turn left. But it doesn't mean I am the car. Or if you damage the car in such a way that the car can't move at all, can't even go, then I'm not going to be able to go. But if I get out of the car, I'll be able to go. But the point of the analogy, I don't think, is just to say that just because you can damage parts of the brain and it will have these other affections to maybe someone's personality or the memory, it doesn't mean you are your brain. That's really the point of the analogy. Obviously, Moreland doesn't go the Cartesian route to say that we actually are like a little person up in our heads.
Yes. Moreland seems to have some of your Thomistic tendencies. For example, he believes that the soul is what ultimately gives the body its form, which is why he says there's experiments where you can remove the DNA from a cell and it'll still develop to a level before the thing dies. So it shows that the DNA isn't 100% the thing that gives an organism its final shape or its final development, at least according to the research you read. I personally can't comment on that because I haven't read it. But it gives more of a Thomistic sense.
I recommend, by the way, read Body and Soul, Human Nature in Crisis by J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray. This is talked about in a whole lot more detail in that book. The first half is the best. That's written by Moreland, where he defends dualism, and then he goes into a chapter on Thomistic dualism, and then Scott Ray writes the second half, where they apply it to things like abortion and euthanasia and all that stuff. So, highly recommend it, everybody. And that's also where he talks about the Chinese room argument.
Oh yeah, John Searle's famous.
John Searle's developed a famous counterexample, which
To what?
Let's talk about this here too.
Okay.
Because one common thing I hear from materialists, even here on YouTube, is well, let's back up here. One argument for dualism is the idea that it goes back to Plato and Leibniz used this. It says a material object can't think, because material things, like this guitar tuner right here, isn't about anything. The thoughts are about something. Like I can have a thought about the sun or what went on during the Big Bang or something like that here. But no physical object is about anything. Like how does a physical object think? And Leibniz used the example of a windmill. You could look inside the windmill, you can see all the parts moving to make the windmill work, but none of those things are about anything. It's the same with brains.
All right, so what you're saying basically is that when we talk about our thoughts or talk about our mind, we're assigning properties that just aren't reducible to physical properties. I have a thought, let's say the sky, let's say the sun is shining right now. In fact, it's shining on my face. That thought, therefore, that's a statement, it's a proposition, it's true. Now, can we assign any of those truth values to physical states? Like, it doesn't work the same way.
Yeah. Like, I can have a true belief. I think Alvin Planning has probably mentioned this too. Like, I can have a belief that's either true or false, but nothing physical is really, like, again, this awesome guitar tuner.
Yeah.
This isn't true or false here. So that seems to say there's more going on, or at the very least, I think that means that at the very least, I think this proves that a reductive form of materialism is false.
Yeah, unless you want to be like what's called an eliminativism, where you just cross all that stuff out of your vocabulary and say it's all illusory or fictional.
Daniel Dennett, I think, goes that route.
Yeah,
he says consciousness is an illusion.
The difficulty with that is, with most of these like really extreme theories, we can still explain experience in terms of it being illusory. Like Parmenides thought that there really was no motion, that all is one, and that the idea of like having distinctions like between ourselves or between the physical world was all illusory. But on eliminativism, you have to explain away illusions. Like illusions are illusory, and I'm not sure like that works.
Yeah.
So we're gonna ask, okay, we can't quite go the route of eliminativism. But we have these computers, right? They seem to have truth values and aboutness. So is the human brain just like the computer that we're writing it on?
The computer. People bring up computers here. They try to say, well, computers, right? I mean, in fact, we could even we might even, and artificial intelligence, I think, is an example they give here. They say we could build a computer, right, that could, act, do the same functions we can do. It can look, it can think, solve problems, maybe even and communicate just like we could and everything. And yet, even though they're purely physical things, so that seems to be a counterexample. That seems to be how we could show how a physical thing could think.
Yeah, it's how we get all these thoughts here without resorting to dualism, to this idea of a supernatural self. But it has problems. One of them is the Chinese room argument. Which
the Chinese room argument, as I recall, it goes something like, imagine there's a man in this room with he has all these translation books with Chinese symbols. The point is he's by himself and somebody sends him a message on a piece of paper written in Chinese, and then so the guy does not understand Chinese. He can't speak a word of Chinese, doesn't know what the symbols mean. So what he does is he looks in his translation book. So he looks up each symbol, figures out what it says. Translates the message, and let's say the message says, "Do you speak Chinese here?" And so then, after he's deciphered the message, he then looks through all his books and figures out what symbols to write. For he says, "Of course I can speak Chinese here," and writes that message back. So from the person outside the room, the message acts as if this person really can speak and understand Chinese. He's writing it down as if he can, even though he has no idea how to speak Chinese.
Yeah, so it's sort of like we can't define whether you understand something by the input-output procedure. It's not like Alan Turing thought that we could determine whether a system was conscious or understood something based on if I ask this computer system questions and I can't distinguish whether it's a computer system or a human behind it, therefore, like if we can't do it after a certain number of questions, therefore we can declare that the computer is conscious. But what Cyril is showing here is that the person who doesn't speak Chinese, if you have enough detailed enough instructions for the person to sort of grab the Chinese symbols, say, okay, there's this squiggly here and there's this squiggly here, so I'll look it up in the code book. Okay, so if they give me these inputs, I give them these other outputs. So I code, the A bin and B bin, and just hand them out the door. It will look as though the person inside could speak and understand Chinese, but clearly it's not. Understanding is not I guess, definable just in terms of observation. You can't just observe something and therefore conclude it understands it.
Yeah. Another good example is what's called the philosophical zombie counterexample. It's one of my favorite counterexamples to materialism, which a philosophical zombie is just, imagine someone like me. You see some random person, and we could conceive, right, of some organism or some human who acts conscious. You can have a conversation with this person. They seem to be conscious because they can talk to you. They react the same way. Like if you stick them with a pen, they'll say ouch, and they act just like everyone else does. But yet we could conceive of somebody like that who isn't conscious at all. There's nothing going on. It's all just physical reactions and responding to stimuli that makes it look like this person is conscious and has a thought life, but really doesn't. And the idea being that if something like this is what we call a philosophical zombie. So if something like that is possible, it seems to be a problem for materialism because the idea of consciousness seems to be, I guess, irrelevant, or not really irrelevant, but it seems unnecessary on a materialistic. I think what's trying to say is that consciousness shouldn't exist on a materialistic worldview. Like we could imagine organisms acting conscious, but they don't actually have consciousness.
Yeah, that's actually called the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
Like on a materialistic worldview, what on earth is the point of there being these conscious beings? Why can't just there be these non-conscious beings that can still sort of act and eat and evolve and reproduce without actually having this center of self-consciousness sort of behind the head?
Yeah, that would be it. That'd be a philosophical zombie kind of approach.
Yeah.
So
now, if you're like, let's say, John Cyril, and you're absolutely committed to metaphysical naturalism, the idea that the physical world is all that there is, was, or ever will be, the problem may not be solvable. And personally, I think it's because of this just really dogmatic, I would say almost religious commitment to metaphysical naturalism that so many philosophers are just unwilling to accept dualism. And yet there are some who are even atheists who actually are willing to accept it because they recognize it's so difficult on a physical worldview to deal with these issues.
What was the guy's name? The guy who wrote that book, Why the
Self and Its Brain?
No.
Okay,
The recent book that came out, Why the Neo-Darwinian Conception of
No,
Reality.
Nagel.
Thomas Nagel,
Thomas
that's right.
Nagel.
Thomas Nagel. I think Thomas Nagel even recognizes this as well, I think. I know he has I haven't read the book. I know he has a chapter on consciousness. I imagine this is one of the things he probably mentions in that book because it's such a big problem for metaphysical naturalists. So he's definitely one of the more intellectually honest.
Yes, I haven't read the book though. Have you?
No, I have not yet.
Okay. So yeah,
Still probably gonna try and just get through Craig Keener's book on miracles, his 1,000-page book.
Keener has this way of just taking as many pages as he wants to state what he wants to state. So he will go through thousands and thousands of pages if he needs to make his argument. Brevity is not his virtue.
Okay. Why don't we shift here for a moment here? Why don't we talk about the ontological argument a little bit? Since I know that's your favorite. That's his. If any of you guys who have heard of the Messianic Truth have seen his video
it's
on the ontological argument.
Yeah, it's the most popular one.
But first, let's just start off. Let's just talk about Anselm's version of the argument here. Like, what do we think of Saint Anselm's original version? And let's bring, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure if you probably do, especially Anselm just said that if I can conceive of a greatest conceivable being, therefore a perfect being must exist, because it's greater to exist than to not exist. Existence is great making property. Therefore, if I can conceive of this being, he must exist. That's it in a nutshell.
Under Anselm's version, he was thinking, there's these arguments for the existence of God, but might there be just a better one that's purely from thought? He was thinking, if God is going to be the ultimate, like, if you could, the ultimate conceivable, which means like logically possible or let's say describable, there's a difference between conceiving something and imagining it. Like I can't imagine a 1,000-sided polygon, but I can conceive, meaning form a logically coherent concept of it. So, yet, in the same time, I can't conceive of a world where, say, like Fermat's theorem is false because it's true, but I can imagine worlds where it's that way. I mean, difficult math problems sort of operate like that. So Anselm's like, well, if God had every great making property, all right, you have this ultimate being, all right, this being would be like smart, like how smart? As smart as like logically possible, right? As knowledgeable, as powerful as is possible, as wise as is possible, but the being would also exist, right? I mean, it's like you could say, you could have one that's like ultimate and not existing, and the other that's ultimate and existing. And he says, well, the one that's ultimate and existing would be higher up. So like the other would be, the one that's ultimate but not existing would be inferior to it. So once we come up with the concept of this ultimate being, this maximally great being, obviously the existing one is the ultimate one, so therefore God exists.
Yeah, and of course, Theoretical BS actually made a video called Ontological, where this was the version he went after. He went after Anselm's version. And basically, he like so many others, gives Immanuel Kant's objection that existence is not a property, or at least it's not a. Was it existence is not a property, or existence is not a great making property?
You see, I haven't seen the video. I know with Immanuel Kant.
Yeah, because it was Kant's objection.
Kant's objection was simply existence is not a predicate, or it's not a property of something.
Right.
Like if I'm going to talk about, let's say, Cody over here, I can come up with a bunch of properties. Let's say male. Let's say wearing a hat. Philosophers, talkative, fan of Dr. Craig, but existing. I mean, well, if he didn't have existence, he wouldn't have any of those other properties either. So
Peter Singer actually, at the end of his talk on animal ethics, I don't remember the context of this at all, but I just remember how he somehow it was in the Q&A. He was asking something about existence, and then he said. It was responding to the argument, well, wouldn't the animals be better off? The animals wouldn't exist if it wasn't for us wanting to eat them and everything. Then Peter Singer then segued into, well, then you got this weird thing of comparing existence to non-existence. And then he gave the example of, suppose you have a couple, right, that's trying to figure out whether they want to have a kid or not. And then suppose you have somebody say, well, maybe it would be better off. Maybe we would be doing this non-existent child a favor by bringing him into existence. And you see how weird it starts to sound? Like, is it better for this child to not exist? Because, you can't really talk about something that doesn't exist like it exists. You get this weird thing where you're comparing existence to non-existence.
I almost think that was like one of Epicurus's arguments against, like, I think like immortality or something like that of the soul, because he says once you go out of existence, there's no more you. So it's like, are you better off living after you're dead? It's like, well, if you're annihilated after you die, there's no you to be worse off.
Yeah. But yeah, okay,
so now we're going through objections, what, to that? Or
yeah, well, okay, well, I just want to start that off here. Let's just let's just cut to the good stuff here. Let's get to Alvin Plantinga's argument, because everybody here knows about his. I hope. If you haven't, sorry, I guess. I don't know.
Okay.
Read it.
Yes.
Alvin Plantinga just uses modal logic, which just means logic of possible worlds. Drew talks about this.
Yeah.
Watch his video. If you haven't heard it, watch his video about the ontological argument.
In really loose terms, and this is sort of like loose terms, a possible world is a bit like a hypothetical situation. If something is both internally logically coherent and not contradicting what's called a necessary truth, then it's possible. So it's like, possible worlds would be something like, maybe let's say the sky is red. That seems to be, it seems like it could be the case. Like there's nothing really contradictory in that. Let's see what other possible worlds. Where let's say I'm wearing a better shirt.
Like there's a possible world in which I don't exist.
Yeah, I mean you don't seem to be necessary for the world to exist. But there's also things that like aren't impossible worlds. Let's say.
Square circle.
Yeah, with squares. There's no
possible world with square circle.
There's no possible
world. Or where 2
plus
2 has an answer different from 4.
Right, right. I mean, these seem to be the kind of truths that couldn't be otherwise. So when we say possible, we mean it could be the case, whether it is or not. And when we say necessary, we mean it can't be otherwise. It's the way things must be,
like
as opposed to just
can be. 2 plus 2 must equal 4. It's necessary. It cannot be otherwise. And
or the law of non-contradiction is the
and Alvin Plantinga says that if a maximally great being, which we can call MGB, what is he saying? First, I think he gets around. He says that necessary existence, however, is a great-making property. Necessary existence, the idea that a being must necessarily exist.
The thing is, he actually formulated the argument, so you don't even need to do that. Like, you can say, if you say that necessary existence is a great-making property or a perfection or something, oh, excellent, that helps you out tremendously. I mean,
but even
there's
if
still
not,
additional premises. Yeah, if not, and here's why. When Alvin Plantinga thinks of the greatest possible being, he thinks, all right, what would make a being great? And he thinks, well, it's like omniscience and omnipotence and omnibenevolence and infinite or perfect wisdom. But also, you have to think not just in terms of how the being is, but how the being could be. Like if the being just happens to be perfect here, but could have been otherwise, that isn't as great as a being who is necessarily perfect, necessarily omniscient, not necessarily omnipotent, necessarily omnibenevolent. So if a being, though, is necessarily that, well, the being would have to exist necessarily. Otherwise, there's possible worlds in which there is no being to be maximally great. But, in fact, in a sense, it uses Kant's objection to support the argument. If you reject the argument on this basis, well, now Anselm's argument comes right back into play.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah, it actually builds itself in a part based on the main objection to Anselm's argument.
But basically, Plantinga says that if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then he must necessarily exist. That's the argument in a nutshell, which, interestingly, when people at first hear this argument, it is surprising at first to hear that the step 3, which says that if it's possible, it must exist, necessarily is controversial, but it's really not. It's the S5 system in modal logic.
You don't even need to use the S5 just to say that if we describe the being this way, right, in order to be maximally great, it needs to be omnipotent and omniscient in every possible world. Well, then, if the being exists, it exists necessarily. Yeah. Or it just wouldn't exist at all because any being that exists in some worlds and not in others just wouldn't be the maximally great being. So this is a being whose existence would be either necessary or impossible if there's, like, let's say, some contradiction. Yeah, and where's
I gonna go with that here? But before we go any further, though, I would like, obviously this is, I guess it would be. You think it'd be fair to say that the ontological argument is probably the most controversial argument for God's existence? Would you agree that'd be a fair assessment of it? It's the most controversial one.
What do you mean most controversial? If you mean most talked about in the literature, your favorite argument, the Kalam argument, would be the most popular. I don't know if it's the most controversial.
Well,
the ontological argument is controversial.
Well, in the sense that even amongst believers in God, it's so okay. Granted, I think there are a lot of arguments that are well, rambled a bit here. Yeah. Even amongst believers in God, there are quite a few people that don't go side with the ontological argument, like Tim McGrew would be one.
It's also terribly misunderstood.
Like, it is misunderstood. And then you got a lot of atheists first hear it, and even me when I first heard the argument, I just kind of thought like, what? Because I first read about it in Reasonable Faith by Dr. Craig. Because I remember I first heard that and I thought, wait, what? How does this work here? It is one of those arguments like Theoretical BS once said. When you first hear it, you just kind of go, wait, what just happened? Kind of thing here. And so I sympathize when atheists, first hear it and they have this kind of reaction to it, like, well, that's just stupid here. Because at first it does sound kind of silly, but once you understand it, I think it is actually a pretty good argument. I think, but also, it's not, it's often remarked. I think Robert Madel might have been one to say this, or very few people have ever actually come to believe in God on the basis of this argument here. So in that sense, why would, because I know you think it's your favorite argument. Why would you say, in light of that, why would you say it's your favorite argument?
It's my favorite argument because it gets all of God's properties in a single argument. Like if someone just believes in the design argument, it may refute naturalism or let's say pantheism, but there's still a great deal of leeway as what you can get God to be. Even I'd say with fully biblical revelation, right? You get the full Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament.
There's no argument will get you the Trinity.
And the New Testament. Pardon?
No argument will get you no natural theology will get you the Trinity.
Yeah, none I can think of. None I can think of. There might maybe some future philosopher will come up with some powerful knockdown argument for the Trinity.
But though you kind of came close in your video where you gave that argument about how again, guys, watch Drew's video here. This is so you'll give context what I'm talking about.
Yes, which is on your channel.
Which is on my channel. I've mirrored it, actually.
It's the ontological argument.
So if you're on my channel here, you're going to have to look to the left where you'll see my videos here and just scroll down.
Yeah,
I love interacting, by the way, with the YouTube. Whatever most probably going to be around my video here. But it says mirror, ontological argument for the triune God. But anyway, at the end you say that you argue against Unitarian monotheism, which says there's one person.
Yeah, hold on. Let's make the distinction here because this is something I do a lot when I, let's say, argue with the rabbis over the idea of God. Like all the monotheistic religions, like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or Rabbinical Judaism, all believe that there is one God. That's called monotheism. There is one God. What we differ over is Unitarianism. Unitarianism says God is one person. So we have monotheism, there is one God. Unitarianism, God is one person. We agree on the former, we don't agree on the latter. And I've given something of an argument against Unitarianism in that one of these maximally great perfections would be to be necessarily, let's say, loving. Like some being would have to have this property of loving in all possible worlds. Well, since God isn't dependent upon creation, and unless you're a Spinoza type, but since God isn't dependent on creation, there are possible worlds, ways reality could be, in which God exists and creation doesn't. In those worlds, how is it we say God is loving? Well, if you have this one personal God, unipersonal, one center of self-consciousness, exists alone, God loves himself, is that loving? Actually, I asked one rabbi this. He's like, no, that wouldn't count.
Like, how can you express properties like love and kindness and compassion if only you exist? Or if there's only one person, so...
Yes, if there's only one person, but if there's multiple centers of self-consciousness, there would be an expression of one center of self-consciousness, one person, toward another center of self-consciousness.
But this wouldn't get you to the Trinity, because it doesn't specify how, it just says there has to be at least
there could
two.
There could be two.
So for all this is concerned, there could be 5 or whatever, for all this argument's concerned.
So it's not going to give you a perfect Trinitarian view of God, but it helps to sway, I guess it might help to sway the debate more toward the Trinitarian view of monotheism as opposed to absolute Unitarian monotheism. Right. More of a complex unity. And actually, some of the Kabbalists, these like Jewish or rabbinical mystics, admit a little bit of this. They think of God as having a complex unity. So this isn't just restricted to Christian monotheism.
Now, well, let's finish up the ontological argument. This is I'm going to end on the Kalam argument here. But before we do here, now obviously one common way to combat Plantinga's ontological argument is to sort of invert. The first premise just says it's possible that a maximally great being exists. So you invert that saying, it is possible that a maximally great being does not exist, and then what it would seem you get the conclusion that therefore it does not necessarily exist. And one way I know Dr. Craig always counters it usually is he just he builds it in as part of a cumulative case. He just says, well, we assume we've established these other arguments like the Kalam, the design. It seems to at least lend more plausibility to the idea that it is possible than not possible, but that may not be satisfying, I think, to some, and that's where the modal perfection argument comes in, which, frankly, I think Craig should talk more about that on his reasonable faith side. The
modal perfection argument, I guess it's kind of a higher level and more difficult argument. It was invented, as far as I know, by Robert Madel, who was coming up with an idea, like we have with the arguments, if it's possible that God exists, then God exists. Most philosophers will agree to that. These actually aren't very controversial. That's not a very controversial premise. The controversial one is
Is it actually possible?
Is it possible that God exists, or is it possible that God does not exist? It's one of the two. It can't be both.
And the goal I think he's getting at here is to try. He's trying to come up with a reductio.
How do we break the stalemate? Then?
Yeah. How do we break the stalemate?
Actually, not me. Madel was thinking of what kind of argument can we do to show that it's possible or it's impossible for a maximally great being to exist, that the negation leads to an absurdity. So it would go like this. One, if if a property is a perfection or a great making property, let's say, its negation would be an imperfection. If something, if it's a property that would that would be necessary for maximal greatness, obviously to lack it would be inferior. I mean, it would detract. I mean, that's pretty much axiomatic. That's also that's actually pretty uncontroversial as well.
Right.
The second would be I'm trying to think of number two. I know the maximal greatness is one of those.
Second, great making properties do not entail lesser making properties.
Oh yes, they don't entail negations, or to say a perfection doesn't entail an imperfection.
Right.
So if someone has omniscience, that isn't going to entail something
it's
that
not
would
going to
detract from maximal greatness.
So if you,
in fact, I guess you need to show an example if it didn't. Because if it didn't, that would actually that would pretty much scuttle perfect being theology, I think.
And then the third
it's
premise.
also not terrible. That's not terribly controversial either.
And the third premise is what's the third premise?
The third premise is simply maximal greatness or being supreme.
Yeah.
As Madel puts it, being supreme is a perfection or a great making property.
Right. And then from there,
and the idea of being supreme is having maximal greatness and having it to the exclusion of all other beings. That way, there's only one God.
Let me see if I can help explain how so if we accept those three premises, which seem uncontroversial to me at least. Third one's probably the most one. But if we accept those premises and what follows from that, which then if you try to say that a maximally great being is if you agree with those three premises, the argument then is that you can't say a maximally great being is impossible without contradicting one of those three premises.
Right, because let's say maximal greatness is if it is a perfection, all right, and it's a perfection, and perfections don't entail imperfections, right? Perfections,
right?
All right. So let's assume that there is no maximally great being, or it's possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist, which would mean that there is no being that has maximal greatness or is supreme. There's no one that has being supreme. Well, that would mean that every single being then would have an imperfection. Every single being, and since perfections don't entail imperfections, it would mean that there would be just no perfections whatsoever.
It'd be contradictions.
It would pretty much wipe out this whole. I guess it would be like with axiological nihilism.
Which just axiological nihilism, just so you guys know, just means that there is no objectively great making or lesser making properties. It's all subjective. There's no such thing as great making or lesser making properties.
And if that's not enough, it would contradict premise 3, which is that maximal greatness is a perfection.
Yeah. So that's the modal perfection argument.
You basically would have to deny one of the premises. I mean, the philosophers I would talk to would try to deny premise 3. But it just doesn't seem very plausible. It's like maximal greatness seems to be like, if anything is a perfection, that would be a perfection. If you want to go against that, you pretty much need a good argument against perfect being theology.
And
philosophers have tried it, but for the most part, or I would just say overall, they failed.
It seems overall what you'd really have to finally do, it just gives some sort of argument for the logical incoherence of God or something like that.
Of a maximally great or perfect being.
Although at that point you're kind of not really going after so much after the ontological argument. You're just sort of giving an argument for atheism.
You're giving an argument against any sort of perfect being theology.
I guess that might be another appeal, because it almost forces the atheists, when you get them to this point, to have to defend their atheistic worldview.
It actually would put the burden of proof on the atheist at that point, because it means, okay, you need to scuttle perfect being theology, or else you'll need to accept the argument.
But and finally here, of course, one objection is, which is what No More, who's an atheist here on YouTube, very staunch metaphysical naturalists, very creative, I must say, in how he argues. But he tries to say that he goes for modal skepticism, basically. If any of you have watched this, have seen his video, you know what I'm talking about. He tries to say that because the whole argument is dependent on actual possibility versus epistemic possibility. Epistemic possibility just means, for all, if we say something's epistemically possible, it means for all we know, it could be possible. Like Dr. Craig gives the example, suppose you see a really complicated math equation with an answer, and you just don't understand it. Where you say, well, it's possible that it's correct, but it's either necessarily correct or necessarily false. You're just giving an epistemic possibility. And No More tries to say that, you know, no matter, even if you go with Robert Madel's argument, it only gives you epistemic possibilities. So he says. And therefore, because you can't know with absolute certainty.
Yeah, well, that's not so much an objection against this argument as it is an objection against what's called alethic or truth-bearing modal logic or like possibility. And yeah, that's the thing. I'm sure if you want to go to that, like the heights of that skepticism, it would mean that any argument you could give or any statement you could say about like whether something is sort of broadly logically possible or not is just false.
It would seem to me it would kind of damage some arguments against the existence of God. Like, wouldn't the logical problem of evil kind of be out the window at that point? If you're going to go from modal skepticism, we can't really say what's possible or impossible. It would seem to kind of throw out the logical argument from evil.
Yeah, it would be, because the logical problem of evil is to say that there is no possible world in which a maximally great being exists, or a maximally great being and evil coexist. There's no possible world which has both of them, and because we have one, we don't have the other. So it really does use alethic modal logic to sort of get its point. Hey, here's your cat.
It's my cat's name? Gordon. This is my cat.
At least show your cat to the camera.
Here
we go. See, there's your cat.
My cat, continue here.
Okay.
He just came up to me, so.
I'm also trying to think of what else, like, what other absurdities follow.
I was thinking too. I suppose. What was I going to say here?
How about this?
Like I was trying to think of other ways it could damage atheists. Oh, that was it here. Like even I would think even basic arguments, because some atheists try to say that there's maybe a logical incoherence in some concept of God. Like maybe there's like a conflict between omnipotence or omniscience or something like that.
Yeah.
But if you really can't, but if you want to go modal skepticism, I mean, then how can you really say? Because then you could raise the same point. Well, then how do you really know it's impossible? Do you know with absolute certainty that your argument is correct here? I mean,
even like probabilistic arguments from evil, where we say, well, it's probably not the case where God exists in a world with this much evil. Like it depends on us having knowledge of what could or could not be the case. Even statements like when we argue the Titanic. If it had earlier warnings, it could have avoided the iceberg, right? We can make statements like that, but that's
if the watertight bulkheads had gone higher than E-deck. Seriously, I'm a bit of a Titanic somewhat history buff. James Cameron got it very accurate, by the way, in the movie. That line where he says the watertight bulkheads don't go higher than E-deck, which is why the water spilled. I'm getting off topic. But yes, if they had gone higher than E-deck, the ship might not have sank.
But these whole statements require some sort of like alethic modal logic in order to have any force whatsoever. Because I could say, well, that's not true. The Titanic could have been a tin whistle, and it would be the Titanic. It's like, it seems like you need that in order, those kind of essential properties, in order to make your discourse of what could be or could have been even coherent. So you can go for that kind of crazy skepticism, just like people with the arguments for like the historical Jesus, and they go for this just wild historical skepticism.
The ones who say Jesus never existed, or
there's that, but I guess there's other arguments.
maybe,
some of the
maybe we can go into that in another video here. But let's,
for a later video.
Yeah, this video is running long, but it's okay because I can upload videos longer than 15 minutes.
But can you split this into multiple videos or not?
Probably. Oh well, I'll see what I can do here. I just really hope once I click that stop recording button, nothing happens. I hope I don't lose all this, but whatever. But fine. Let's talk about the Kalam cosmological argument. Okay. The argument is so well known here on YouTube that I don't even think it's necessary to even lay out the premises. Even Das American Atheist kind of made a joke. Das American Atheist is another really popular atheist here on YouTube.
Yes, there are possible worlds where we don't lay out all the premises.
But he even kind of said when he was laying out, he's like, I feel I shouldn't even mention the premises because it's so well known. But for completion's sake, say it with me, everybody. And then he laid out the premises. Okay. But anyway, everybody knows about this argument. A lot has been said on it, thanks to Dr. Craig. And the debate on this argument, so much about this argument has been said here on YouTube. I've even gotten into a few lengthy, long private message conversations about this. I've made a few videos. Most of my videos, I think, are about this argument because it's my favorite. So
yeah, it's a good argument.
Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit here. Let me go over some of the of course, I've talked with Dr. Craig a bit about this argument.
Yes, I know. You're that much of a big shot.
So why don't we, because everybody's thinking about this, why don't we talk a little bit about Theoretical BS's, aka Scott Clifton's, objection to the Kalam, because it's a very popular video. It's got over 50,000 views, or close to 50,000, something like that. But
okay. Well, he knows that I don't.
His objection, from what I understand, is bottom line, he's trying to say that creation ex nihilo, actually causing something to exist out of nothing, leads to logical contradictions, is what he's trying to say here.
What logical contradictions might
what logical? Yeah, this is where I have to admit, I'm a little hazy here. He seems to do this. He first gives a definition of causation, namely David Hume's definition.
Which is what?
Which is, he says every instance of causation we see in the world is always, you have the thing, and then you have something acting on that thing. Like, for example, the classic example is a carpenter. Like, he takes a block of wood, and then he carves it out to make a chair, right?
Okay.
Whereas when God creates the whole universe out of nothing, he's not acting on anything. There's nothing for him to act on. So you have to say God is causing nothing. He's
not anything.
Causing not anything or something along those lines. And this somehow, I guess, is supposed to be a logical contradiction here. Because, I admit I'm a little fuzzy. And maybe I'll go back and reread some of this stuff here. But because I've watched all three of his videos about this. And I don't know. If you define causation the way he did, where you have to have something acting on something, then I suppose you could say it's impossible. But first of all, I guess the way I pin this down is causation is, just because you have a definition doesn't somehow mean you can somehow exclude other things from that. Like, I remember Dr. Craig once said that, suppose you have a definition of causation, right? That somehow, if you can apply it, meant that pulling the trigger of a gun did not actually cause the bullet to fire. Well, you wouldn't impose the analysis on that and say that, well, therefore, it's impossible that I caused the bullet to fire by pulling the trigger here, because this definition of causation that I've come up with doesn't fit with that.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with our intuitions.
You'd say that intuitions, it seems very intuitively plausible. And I would kind of been thinking about this too, because, we watch things like Harry Potter or whatever, or, people pop things. We don't think that, there's some contradiction going on here.
It is a fantasy movie, though.
Yeah, it is a fantasy movie. I know here.
Okay.
I know Scott tries to say that, when it comes to illogical and absurd wins out any day. The idea of something coming into existence uncaused out of nothing. Maybe absurd, but this is illogical, because how does God...
Does he know the definition of... the strict definition of absurd is meaningless.
Meaningless?
That's literally meaningless. Now, we can use absurd... We often use absurd in these sort of, like, an analogy type sense. Like, that's crazy. It is like from Fiddler on the Roof. It's like that. My daughter with this poor guy. Absurd.
I guess what he's trying to add. I don't think because I don't recall him specifically saying why it's logically contradictory. I think he's just sort of saying, what does it even mean? He claims that nobody really knows what that even means, to say that God creates something out of nothing. Like, how does that work? As he says, what does it even mean? He says, well, Dr. Craig, he says, doesn't know what this means. any more than I do, so he says. So, but I don't know. I mean, I think I think perhaps it'd kind of go back maybe to the dualism thing. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say just there's a mystery to it, yes, but I don't know. I guess this reflects my own psychological state. I'm not seeing how just because I don't know exactly how creation ex nihilo works, therefore me it's logically impossible. I mean, I keep thinking about it. It seems to be a kind of argument from ignorance, if you ask me, but I don't know.
So I guess I would ask, like, I don't know him very well. Does he think it's just absurd, or illogical for something to come into existence? Anything to come into existence.
Out of nothing, or just come into existence?
Out of nothing.
Out of nothing. Well, no, because he stated, he says I don't have any problem per se with the idea of something coming into existence out of nothing without a cause, but with a cause, he says that would be logically contradictory. He says because, and I know Dr. Craig, when he talks about, once said in the debate, he said, I don't know how God creates out of nothing, but it's doubly absurd to say there's creation without an efficient or material cause. It's doubly absurd to say that. And here I think Scott kind of made a little error in his video because he then used Scott then tried to use it, he tried to yeah, I guess you say whatever, I can't think of the word for this, but he said well, if hitting a home run without a baseball bat is absurd here, it's doubly absurd to say that you can hit a home run without a baseball or a baseball bat here, as if that was somehow analogous to what Dr. Craig was saying. Like, I think he's trying to say that, you can't hit a home run without a baseball bat here and just the ball. But that's not what Dr. Craig is saying when he says there's material and efficient cause. Because that analogy of the baseball bat presupposes that you need both of these things to go together.
That you need material cause.
Yeah, you need material.
All efficient causes require material cause.
Yeah, I think I think that is what he's saying. All efficient causes would require material cause.
Did we explain to the audience here the difference between an efficient
and
material cause?
Let's do that.
Dr. Gray was talking about this in class today. Aristotle has 4 different types of causes. Like, he divides what cause means into 4 different types. One is efficient cause, which is like when you're acting on something, or the carpenter carving something out of wood. The carpenter would be the efficient cause, whereas the material cause would be like the wood itself. The third is the formal cause, which is just whatever shape something takes. It's like that Thomistic dualism stuff. The formal cause is part of that. And then the final cause is like the ultimate purpose for which something exists. Like, I declare that I've carved this thing out of wood, this like door wedge out of wood to stop the door. That's like the final cause for it. So what we're doing is basically separating material cause from efficient cause. The question is, can an efficient cause exist even if it's not out of some pre-existing material object?
Still recording, keep talking.
Okay, so basically now Cody is like,
I'm just pulling up pull-ups because there's a section in Scott's article where he talks a little bit, because he actually wrote one of his video stuff in a Tuesday blog.
On the 12 Tuesday blog.
12 Tuesday blog, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, trying to get his argument up here.
Yeah, we're probably going to talk about this in another video here, because I just haven't, granted I haven't looked at this in a while, and maybe when I put this up on my Facebook, maybe Noah will comment on it or something here.
Yeah, I guess my objection to his view would be this. When we talk about theistic causes, right, like theistic causes of God, we can at least sort of restrict what these things can explain and cannot explain. We can come up with theological arguments, for example, that God, let's say, didn't create the Earth 6,000 years ago with all the appearances of age and light on its way and supernovas that never happened, because it would be inconsistent with the cause of a perfect God. Whereas when we have nothing, or no cause whatsoever, that really doesn't explain things like why anything and everything doesn't come into being just without any purpose. Or it wouldn't explain why I can't say the universe popped into being 6,000 years ago with all the appearance of age and light on its way. At least with theological arguments, you can say God's character is such that he wouldn't do that.
Okay.
If you don't have theological explanations, then it just denies you that reason, against that cause.
I've just been skimming through Scott. He lumps a few things in here, like he talks about how we've only ever seen causation by being previously existing material come into existence here.
So basically, this would be almost like a denial of the second premise, that the universe came into being without a material cause.
But yet, well, no, the second premise is just the universe began to exist.
Yeah, which means the physical world. Like that, when he uses the term universe, he doesn't just mean this space-time manifold, but physical reality in its entirety came into existence.
No, but yet but he explicitly is denying that. He says he's only going after the first premise here, because he's trying to say that even if you get the beginning of the universe, he's saying that this first premise won't go through. He says, to propose that a being caused the universe to begin existing, you should infer, so far as we understand causality to work, that non-universe material was reassembled in such a way as to become the universe. That's the only way we've ever seen things come into existence. So that would obviously be the most parsimonious explanation.
Okay.
But this is not what you're proposing. You believe God brought the universe into being without ever having caused anything of any kind. Yeah, see, I think it's all based on what we mean by causality.
Oh, all right. So what he seems now, what I'm reading here is it seems like he's going with what's called like an empiricist view. Now, empiricism is the idea,
like David Hume.
Yeah, the idea that there of the entire peripatetic school, the idea that there is nothing in the consciousness that wasn't first in sense experience, and I think that is patently absurd. For example, there's nothing in our sense experience that can give us any idea of causation whatsoever. Like any argument you could give, like I see something repeatedly happening. I toss this guitar pick up and I grab it, and I try to infer something from it. I'm still inferring causation from that. Or there was one postmodernist who would collect mushrooms, but he realized that some of the mushrooms were poisonous, so he couldn't just be a complete postmodernist. But not only did he believe, like in, let's say, the law of non-contradiction, but also in causality. He knew that, like, he deep down believed that if he takes like a poison mushroom and eats it, that would cause him to get sick and die. So it's intuitively in us, but when you have this sort of sense experience, there's no way to build up from just raw sense data into this idea of causation. The idea has to pre-exist before even probabilistic arguments presuppose causation, and Hume admitted it and just declared himself a skeptic.
And Scott here is constantly saying how we've never seen this kind of creation out of nothing before.
Right.
I mean, he seems to be sort of. I mean, it really is very similar, frankly, to what people like Wes Morrison. I mean, I know he keeps saying that his argument's different from Wes Morrison's objection.
Yeah.
Wes Morrison does talk about how the idea of creation out of nothing seems to be kind of absurd. Because Wes Morrison talks about in his article that we've only ever seen things come into existence via a rearrangement of previously existing material kinds of things. But of course, I think as we're both seeing, that doesn't lead to the conclusion that therefore it's logically impossible. I mean, it's just a strong claim, I think. I'm just not entirely seeing fully how he's going from this to therefore it's logically impossible.
Well, think of it this way. When we think of it like in books of, let's say, fiction, right? When you write fiction or you watch movies or something like that, someone could at least write about someone bringing something into existence without a material cause.
Yeah,
that at least seems,
that's what I was trying to say.
That at least seems logically coherent. Whereas when we talk, like, if you start writing about things just popping into existence, maybe like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, like that, it's still at a cause. I mean, the infinite improbability drive is like the very thing that made all this wacky, crazy stuff happen. So it's like even then you're not doing it without a cause.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think we have to derive some of these from our intuitions. Now, how these intuitions got there, personally, I think only a theistic explanation is really going to give you the kind of innate ideas you need in order to have a full view of knowledge. If God exists, he could have at least programmed us with enough innate ideas that we could express them through language and that we could understand our world. With a purely empiricist view, where you're like starting out purely from sense experience, there's huge limits to what we could know in principle, but if God exists, there's no in-principle limits to what we could know. And we have to just look from basically from our intuition.
Maybe in a later video we'll come back and talk more about Scott's argument here. I'm not claiming this is concluded here. Maybe it'd be better if Drew here would read. So maybe you should at least read his article.
We should wait until another week and make these things like 30-minute segments. Or if you could split this video up, that would be
I'll try and split this video up.
If not, then we can make an index for it so you don't have to.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'll do it. Yeah, hopefully, if you see, there'll be a time index here, or I'll put an annotation in the beginning of the video.
Or even in like the description underneath, you could like have like a
This is
time
going to be
code.
redundant for people watching, because presumably people who are watching this have already done all this here, and so they're going to be thinking, why are you talking about all this? We already see the annotations.
Because of Bill and Ted, just the same reason as Bill and Ted's excellent,
But let's
do that.
Let's talk about
future selves.
Let's talk about aspects of the Kalam that aren't discussed on YouTube very much, and these are the philosophical arguments that I rather like for the second premise. Now let's skip Hilbert's Hotel. A lot of people are familiar with that. I think the one that needs to get more attention is the second one, which when Veritas48 did his video on the Kalam, this was the argument he really defended for.
Well, it's because Moreland defends it.
Which is the argument, for those of you who don't know, that says that you cannot traverse an infinity. And for example, like if I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm never going to reach a point where I've counted an infinite amount of numbers.
Yeah, it results in absurdity.
And granted, this presupposes a tensed theory of time, which says that the present is real and that you're sort of, going from one day to the next. But if the past were infinite, it means the present would have never arrived, because the present would have had to have gone through an infinite series of events, and thus could never have gotten to today.
And a lot of people seem to misunderstand what the paradox is.
Yeah.
The paradox is not like, let's say I was counting down all the negative numbers and I arrived at 3, 2, 1, 0, like right now. The argument is not if I was counting down an infinite number of numbers, I wouldn't be finished by today. Instead, the argument is for any point in time or any day, if I'm finished by now, I should have been finished yesterday, because eternity was just as over yesterday as it is today. So it's like eternity was just as over yesterday. Why didn't I hit 0 yesterday? Well, let's look at yesterday. All right. For yesterday, it's like, why didn't I do it the day before? And why didn't I? So for any point in the finite past, you can always make an equally good argument. Why didn't I hit 0 the day before? And if it doesn't hit any point in the finite past, then you haven't been counting down from infinity, and the whole idea is absurd.
Now we're going to be talking a lot of philosopher objections, because this argument's not talked about on YouTube much, but I did make a video to a user called No True Scotsman, who I think misunderstood the argument, because he said, let's say that this space between, he used fingers, he had a graph on his screen, but we'll use my fingers for this.
Okay.
Let's say this represents an infinite amount of time here, They're saying you can't cross through, but that's not what we're saying. He was kind of using the paradox of motion here, like you simply start walking from one to the other. What did I say in that video? He basically misunderstood it. He was trying to say that...
Does he believe that there's an infinite number of points between your two fingers?
Yeah, that's what he was trying to say
Or if I have the distance between my two fingers, I can divide it in half, and divide that in half, and I can divide that in half.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like that, yeah.
Which is different than saying that there's an infinite number of actual divisions or points between the two fingers. I don't think that, first of all, points exist, and second of all, Aristotle said that you could start with a distance. It pre-exists any points you can later specify. It's logically in a different order.
Well, but let's get into what some of the objections are here.
Okay.
I've been talking a lot about Wes Morrison. He actually did a podcast a while back here. Luke Milhauser on the Common Sense Atheism blog interviewed Wes Morrison. This was not long after his dialogue with William Lane Craig, which I'm into Craig's Defenders class, guys. I'm disappointed too. The recording quality of that debate was so poor, or poor.
He actually talked to Dr. Craig?
Huh? No. I asked Dr. Craig about when the Wes Morrison debate would be up, and it's not going to, guys, because the recording quality was so bad. They couldn't market it. The transcript, Dr. Craig said, had so many holes because the recording quality was terrible. So I don't think we're going to be seeing that, which is such a disappointment.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's move on now. The common objection, it's not just Morrison, Graham Oppie says these kind of things too, is Morrison was asking, well, what do you mean when you say traversing infinity? What do you mean by that? He says, obviously, if I start counting and go, well, of course I'm not going to get infinity. Nobody denies this point here. And he says, but in the case of the infinite past, there is no starting point. So he says, what's being claimed here is that at every point in the infinite past, you've already crossed an infinite amount of days.
Yeah, for any day in the finite past.
For every day in the infinite past. And every day in the infinite past, you've already crossed an infinity here. You've always crossed infinity. And if you have a problem with that, says Morrison, well, now your objection is just to the idea of the actual infinity itself, not just crossing an infinity. But I'm not so sure that really works here, because first of all, it seems that you're committed to, one example which I think Craig needs to use more is crossing an infinity is like jumping out of a bottomless pit. You know, how do you jump out of a bottomless pit here? Couldn't you run the same kind of thing with a bottomless pit? Well, you never actually jumped. You just at every point in the pit that you're jumping out,
well,
jumped.
Yeah, that's the thing. If there's no floor, then you haven't jumped out of anything. It's not like jumping into a bottomless pit, which you can jump and you keep going on forever.
Yeah, and I don't think that's the problem with the actual because we're not saying that there's you know, the infinity can't be there. I mean, this is still about, well, how do you move through an infinite series of days here? Like, I mean, I've thought a lot about this here. Like, wouldn't there have to, it would seem to me that there would have to be a day that is infinitely distant. I mean, think of, there's a day, if the past is infinite, there is a date in the past that is infinitely distant from today.
Yes.
So that seems contradictory. Because how could you then get from that date that's infinitely distant? I mean, we're not saying you're starting from that date, because even in that infinitely distant date, there's
still infinitely more.
Yeah, there's still infinitely more behind it. But let's just mentally start from there, even though the person's already gotten to this. And then how do you get from there across this infinity to today? See, think about that for a moment here. How do you do that? I think that's a good thought experiment. I hope I explained it clearly, because you're not starting. He's always gone, but how do you get from the infinite distant to today?
So if there's any points in the past that, let's say, you haven't needed to cross, and if it's infinitely away, then
then you can't get there. But because if you're going to say the past is infinite, you'd have to say there is a date that is infinitely distant.
Yeah.
That you would have had to have gone from to get to today.
Another philosophical argument.
And then there's.
I'm sorry, you're not done with this argument.
That's fine here. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's been a while since I've listened to the podcast. Maybe if I listened to it right before it, I probably would be a little bit more revved up and really have some more to say. But then there's we'll talk a little bit about more. The other argument, I think, were you going to do the Saturn orbiting thing?
No, I was going to do a different one. It's an argument of what's called a supertask.
The supertask. The Tristram-Shandy paradox?
No, it's different from that. I remember Alexander Proust once on his blog talked about this. And it's in the book Zeno's Paradox. It's available on Amazon if you want to buy that. Let's say you have a marble moving machine, right? And let's say it's what it does, it'll take like a marble from one side and just move it to the other. So let's say it's like 11:30 at night. Okay, so in 15 minutes it moves a marble, all right? Yeah, and then in half that time, so it's like 11:45. And then halfway between that time, it moves another marble. And then halfway again between that and midnight, it moves again. Halfway, it moves another. Halfway, it moves. How many marbles will it have moved by midnight? And the answer should be
the Grim Reaper paradox.
Yeah, the answer should be an infinite number of them. The problem with Dr. Craig, there's a bunch of different counter arguments to Zeno's paradoxes, but Dr. Craig gave the absolute simplest one, which I don't know if it was in the book. The answer is, well, if a machine could do that, there would have to be some last marble, some infinity F marble. Yeah. That is like actually like a contradictory. Like at what point, what was that last point before midnight? When the machine stopped. And for any point you pick between, like, it's before midnight, there's still an infinite number of points between like midnight and that point, so that you just never get to that one last marble. And if you can't get to that last marble, then the whole paradox just falls apart.
Yeah. Frankly, I don't really know how to get out of it. I think this is a good argument. I think the only way to really get out of it is just embrace the B theory of time and say that there is no moving through infinity, that the infinity is just there statically. That's the only way reasonable way I can think to get out of this argument. But I always like the Al-Ghazali's paradox of, like, was it say for every one orbit of Saturn, Jupiter makes two orbits?
That sounds about right.
So, like, as it goes around, the number of orbits they make, like 1, 2, and then it's 2, 4, and then 3, 8, 3, 8, and the gap between them is going to get further and further apart as you go. But if you flip it around and say they've been doing this for eternities past, it's suddenly magically back to the same.
Yeah, instead of like falling further and farther behind, then once you hit infinity, like the infinity has this property that's totally different than the arbitrarily large one.
It just flips it around.
It gets farther behind. It should be infinitely far behind from one perspective, but from another perspective, they've caught up.
Yeah, that just seems to be an absurdity about the infinite.
And you can argue for both. That's the thing. It's like simultaneously both infinitely far behind and caught up too.
Yeah, that was, what did Dr. Craig say Peter Atkins' reply to this was?
Oh, I don't know.
Or, it was something like, well, Saturn doesn't make 2 orbits for every one.
Yes, people are like, I'll bet you people will be looking up objections like this. I'm like, wait a minute, Saturn, takes this much time and Jupiter takes this much time and it's not an exact figure, so therefore you're wrong because of astrophysical garbage like that.
Yeah.
I totally missed the point of the argument.
Yeah. I do wish this argument would get talked about more on YouTube. The scientific evidence I can see, I see why it gets the most attention. I think because people are very, I think it's defensive about we're using empirical evidence to support our argument.
Yeah, because otherwise what they can do is they can argue that philosophers will deduce things from their own intuitions, and since our intuitions aren't just inherently reliable, if it results in these things, your intuitions are wrong. But when we have science in the argument, it's like the XKCD, stand back, I'm going to try science.
Oh, yeah, so I'm going to try Noah actually had that on his face for a while.
As soon as you start doing that, though, then people get nervous, like, whoa, science, this is how we know the world, this is reality.
Yeah.
And once you use those arguments in favor of some of these premises, that starts to scare people.
And then, there's of course the Tristram Shandy paradox, which just is about a guy who writes.
It's the same thing, though. It's the same argument as
the Saturn-Jupiter thing.
Yeah.
I actually think it's even better. I think it makes it a little bit more clear. I actually like it a little bit better, just because it really kind of hits you like.
Yes, as long as we do the Tristram Shandy paradox in terms of.
I did make a video on the Tristram Shandy paradox. It's in my list, so if you want to see that, go watch it. Or I explain what the Tristram Shandy paradox is.
Do you have any more material to go through, or are we gonna video?
Well, this is the last bit of the card. Let's finally talk about the last part of the argument.
Because this thing is like the length of a movie.
Yeah, hour and 15 minutes here, whatever. Well, Veritas's video on the Kalam was 54 minutes long.
Yeah, that's Veritas.
Maybe it's like I do love, by the way, Jack Together for Peace. There's an atheist user called Tool Time. He did a response, and Jack Together for Peace did a satire of this. Jack's a Christian here. Your friend's still on Facebook, I think, and he did a satire response to Tool Time. Because Tool Time begins his video by saying, "So I just watched the Kalam argument, 51-minute waste of my life here." So the video is called that Jack made is called Veritas Pwned by Rob the Atheist, where he begins by saying, "Hello, my name's Rob, and I'm an atheist. I'm over here responding to Veritas 40, a 51-minute complete utter waste of my life here, but I watched the video anyway here." And it was funny, I thought. But let's get to the end here. Okay, so the last part of the Kalam, which says that after the universe has a cause, this cause must be a personal, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, incredibly powerful being here. Again, this bit doesn't get a lot of attention on YouTube, I think, either. Yeah. Well, let's see. What are these different? The popular one that Craig uses is he says there's only 2 kinds of things that fit that description. That'd be either an abstract object or an unembodied mind. Okay. And this is going to segue into dualism nicely, I think. But an abstract object can't cause anything. The number 7 can't cause anything. Therefore, it must be a mind. It's part of the definition of abstract. Yeah. Therefore, it must be a mind. Now, a while ago, when I was in my video back and forth discussion with Arizona Superman about this, he replied to me by saying that, and this is the common response here. Well, all the evidence we have of a mind says that a mind is a physical object here, like the brain, and that gets into dualism. But I don't even think you have to make the case for dualism to make this argument. No, you don't need dualism. I mean, really, what you need to do is just say, well, isn't it possible here? Because if the burden is really on them to show that it's impossible. Yeah, but of course,
not just that it's not the case, unless again you're an empiricist and you're not willing to grant that kind of stuff. In which case, your whole metaphysics, if you're a true empiricist, metaphysics itself is just going to go out the window.
But then at that point, if you're going to say an unembodied mind is impossible, I think Dr. Craig was right to point out how then you're kind of going away from the argument and making an argument for atheism at that point.
Yep.
Because if God's an unembodied mind, and if you have an argument that says an unembodied mind is incoherent, well, then you've just proven atheism right there.
Yeah, it's a different.
So I don't think that option's really open unless you just you want to argue for atheism.
Again, it's sort of like the ontological argument.
Yeah,
it's like
you're kind of pushed back.
Now the atheist has the burden of proof.
Now you're pushed back. Yeah,
you've got a hard burden of proof ahead of you.
And of course, I suppose then I think somebody in one of the comments in my videos said, no, Christians or theists have the burden of proof. To show that it's possible here. I was like, well, I don't know. I've always taken the view that something is, I think it's possible unless shown to be not possible, and that just seems to be a good default view to go by. But regardless, the
ontological argument is going to be really weird.
I mean, and here's the thing, though. We already agree at this point in the argument. We're assuming that everything is sound so far. We agree the universe must have a cause. So you've got to present a third alternative at this point, really. I don't think you can just say, unless you're going to retrace your steps and deny one of the first two premises, you've got to say, you've got to give a third alternative here, but nobody can. I remember Wes Morriston, and a lot of the people, even a lot of the atheists on the Reasonable Faith forums have been saying this. They say, well, how do you know those are the only two options? Like, maybe there's some timeless, immaterial being that we don't know about here, which is like, well, can you explain it? Can you give me one? No, they can't. And I always thought, imagine if scientists did that, if there was a competing explanation. Like, I mean, think about it. Imagine if there was what if we did this with evolution or something?
That's what I was thinking.
How do you know? We have all this evidence for evolution here. What do I just say? Well, how do you know that these are the only explanations? Maybe there's some other explanation for this that we just haven't thought of yet here. I mean, would that really
then you're going to use that as justification. Like, imagine if young Earth creationists, that was the argument. You'd laugh at it. Now these internet infidels are using the same argument, and you're like, oh, okay, well, we'll just accept that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the
double standard.
And then there's Swinburne's argument, which Craig uses in the Blackwell, which says that we can give a scientific explanation or a personal explanation, like the example, why is the teapot kettle boiling? Yeah. We could say, well, it's because of the flame, the heat, it heats up the water and does all these chemical reactions, which causes it to bubble. And why is the teapot sitting there boiling? Or you could just say, because I put it there because I wanted to make dinner for you. Both are viable. One's a personal agent explanation. The other is a scientific, physical explanation. Okay. But since the universe, all time, space, and matter comes into existence, there can't be an explanation like that.
A physical explanation, because it's the origin of physical reality.
It's the origin of all physical reality, so it can't be a physical explanation. So it must be a personal agent explanation. And yeah, Arizona Superman's response, he just said, well, no, because he just kind of said, no, the personal explanation doesn't fit, because in fact I would give you, if you say, why is the teapot sitting there boiling, I know people who would give you the scientific explanation unless you ask the question, why did you put the teapot boiling? And bad grammar is no argument for the existence of God here. That was his reply to me, and I think I replied back, I said, no, maybe I phrased it differently in the video, but the question differently, but then fine, I'll just rephrase the question, and the question was just, why is the teapot sitting there boiling here? You can say, because I put it there because I wanted to make dinner. That is a viable explanation for that here. Or you could just give the scientific explanation there. Oh, because the heat is it's sitting there because the heat is causing the water to boil, so I don't really get that. It feels like a semantic response to me, but whatever. Okay. But I think that's good. So
that's good.
Should probably, this has been a lengthy video so far. Definitely should do another one of these sometime.
Okay, absolutely.
So, take care, everybody.
Bye.